Morning. Good morning, sunshine.
How are you, Karen?
Hi, there's Jim. Jim, you awake over there? Yes. Hello? Lauren?
Hello all.
Morning.
Why is it every time I go on Zoom, I look worse than the last time?
You go in through Zoom? You have to go in through Zoom.
No
You
one said,
open up Zoom and then you go
nobody
in.
said, oh, no, you don't.
Yeah, we all do, that's why.
So everyone's voting in the affirmative. Oh, gosh.
I can resend you the link. I don't know. Everyone else is joining. I don't know what to tell you. Let me see. Hold
Never
on a minute.
The
I'll
same.
resend the link to you.
when you-
Try it again. Let's see.
Every time I
Yeah,
join
I'll
Zoom,
send it.
it's
Let's see here. I don't
click
know.
this, don't click that.
It's really weird. Did you go, like I said, go in through Zoom maybe? Did anybody have issues logging in?
Yeah, I did. I couldn't
And
follow.
how did you do it? Because Loring's having issues.
I had to actually log into Zoom directly and then use.
Yeah, you have to log into Zoom first. That's all. Log into Zoom and then come in. You have to be a Zoom user for this
I
one.
just hit the link.
Yeah, my link didn't work.
Okay. My link didn't work last night, so I'm batting 500
Yeah,
at least.
you know what it is? It's because we have it set up that we're trying to put more privacy, but still have it be public, but apparently we can't do that. All right.
Good morning, Kim.
Sorry. So Loring's coming. Hold on.
Morning.
You just have to log in through Zoom to get into it, but I won't set it up like that anymore.
Okay, we'll give you a call.
Loring
No,
said start without her.
You know, I just wanted to let you know that I have a coffee cup that somebody gave me, which says it's great to be king.
And Donna,
I decided not to use that one.
Can I suggest where you might send it?
You already said it.
Donna Cabibbo.
Oh,
Donna Cabibbo. Yeah, that's
Okay.
Charlie Aspinwall used to have what it said, me boss, you not.
and Aaron is opposed by voting.
Or that was something that was really apropos, right?
I know. I know.
Actually, Charlie's
While
been
we're
very,
waiting, while we're
Charlie's been
waiting,
very helpful with us with the PFAS.
while we're waiting, can I bring something up that has nothing to do with the meeting? Just to say, Mike, I've transferred Azure, so it's now under Carol's name. She has all the rights and everything for the town. So it's been transferred away from Richard. Doesn't mean Richard and I and Lisa don't have admin rights, we do. But Carol, as an employee of the town and the senior finance person, has the ultimate rights for how an account can actually be managed at very like when we had to put in credit cards and manage them, she's the one who can do that.
Just moderator.
Good, okay.
Went and sat at finance because she was getting ready for town meeting several years in a row.
What else?
She'll do a good job.
Oh, and one other thing, I'm working
Yeah,
with Carol. It looks like we're finally getting
No.
the WISE management suite issues resolved. I'll talk with her, I
Yes,
hope, a
when
little later
better.
today. I know that it's a short day and you folks only put in about a 4-hour day anyway, so hey, what can I say? When somebody began complaining to me about the number of hours you put in and what you get paid for, I thought, gee, I ought to talk with you about that myself. So Mike, you're muted.
So I don't know.
Sorry,
It's gotta
Pete.
go. I'm just telling you.
I was just getting an update from Karen on some
Oh,
issues here. So she's having trouble with keeping Zoom up. Hopefully it holds together for the meeting.
well, I'm sure we can all reconnect if necessary.
Yes.
And I'm assuming everyone also has Teams. Do they?
Yeah, the problem is you have to make this available to the public. So that's my concern, is that Teams
Yeah,
isn't
there's a
available.
way to do it, but it's a much more complicated process.
Yeah, if we can't make it available to the public, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And it was, so since the meeting was posted with this link, we have to use this link for this meeting.
Ah,
Good morning, everyone.
Lord.
Good morning.
Good morning. lady.
Yeah, I don't think we should be using password protected meetings for public meetings. I don't understand that. That happened last night for the capital planning meeting.
Yeah, that was because John, the chair, had hosted it from home, from his Zoom, and I think that was the first time he had done that. And I believe that the password was posted on the posting, but we're going to try to make sure we don't have people
Yep.
have to.
Yep.
Yeah, it was posted as like a 30-digit
Right.
number. I mean, I tried it 3 times and I couldn't get in.
It was almost like a test. You had to pass the test in order to.
Let's just say that term case sensitive is really important on that one.
Is Jim McKay here? He's breaking Zoom laws by having bright window behind him. So all we see is a little shape.
It's a profile.
Jim, you have to close your blinds and put your light at your face. All right, are we ready to rumble? Good morning, Kim. Good morning, Deidre. Good morning, Aaron. I have my coffee, but clearly I've not had enough. I'd like to convene the May 8th, 2020 Select Board meeting. The entire focus of this meeting is to discuss the realities of our fiscal 21 budget planning. This is an exclusive focus of this meeting, and it will continue for the duration to be the dominant focus of our board going forward. I'm aware of 2 meetings that are upcoming next Wednesday night with the Finance Committee, and of course next Monday, starting late afternoon, the Select Board meeting of May 11th. And I wanted to just start the meeting by thanking everybody who's here and everybody who's worked on this who is not yet here, but I'm sure will be arriving once they conquer Zoom and Wi-Fi and such. I've done a lot of preparation for this, as I'm sure everybody has, and I thought this quote was rather telling from the State House Ways and Means Chair, Representative Aaron Michalowicz, who on April 1st said, in the midst of the continued fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, the fiscal situation in the Commonwealth is facing is both dire and unprecedented. And unfortunately, this was no April Fool's joke, but Millis is in good company. We are among 351 Massachusetts municipalities whose way of delivering services to our taxpayers and constituents must change. And that's the conversation that we are going to continue to have with our community at large, our town hall employees, the volunteer government leadership, who've been poring over dense budgets that were built largely in a different time, using a far more consistent set of assumptions. And in the end, our goal and our obligation is to present a reality budget before town meeting on June 29th. And over a month ago, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, which is a respected think tank that offers and opines about tax and financial policy, as well as the Center for State Policy Analysis, have projected some fairly ominous state budget shortfalls. That the losses are $2 billion and counting for fiscal year 21. And obviously that rolls outward to our town and to every other city and town that relies in part on both generation of revenue at the local level that we've already lost and will never regain, as well as state aid that will never be expected to be anywhere close to what we would have hoped it could be. And so we already know that we've experienced some steep decline in Q4 collections, and I'm going to ask the town administrator and director of finance to address that. And we also have had and have responded to, and I want to acknowledge anybody on the front lines, the unexpected COVID costs that are in fact a moving target, and but they are essential to our response for public safety. The State Commissioner of Revenue more recently in May reported a 52% shortfall against projections. So that's more than half. And they basically announced, and this is all public domain information that I'm just summarizing real quick to kind of set the conversation and the tone. They basically told everybody to go back and start fiscal year budgeting from scratch, and to have fiscal year budgeting reflect whoever's got ambient noise on. If you could just hit mute, I think that would be helpful.
Lauren, can you hear me? It's Karen.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, well, Carol, I'm in Carol's office. Sorry, she was not able to speak before, so we'll be quiet
Okay.
now.
The state has basically said, those people who are driving the state budgeting process for fiscal year 21 have basically said, go back to the drawing board. So I'm really pleased to see the gathering of leaders here, because these are the people on the front lines, and our job is going to be to work collaboratively and transparently. And I want to say to every town employee, represented or management, and to every taxpayer, that we have been called to make very difficult decisions. There is no facet of government services that can be considered sacred. I know that we have talked, at least as long as I've been serving the town, of reinventing government, and that hour is upon us all. We have a $37 million publicly held organization, and in business parlance, we have to balance the budget by tagging and aligning funds to usage. This group, and a group even broader, has to prioritize what is essential versus what is nice to have. We have to come up with new schemes of operating, potentially, and not exclusive to partnering, outsourcing, combining, restructuring, redefining how Millis government works. We simply cannot operate in the status quo. And it's not going to be fun. But I'm really confident that we have an incredibly dedicated team here and beyond, people in back offices, people working from home offices. It seems to me that as a group, we will be contemplating a couple of options. One is whether or not it's good fiscal policy to borrow from the stabilization fund to pay for salaries to sustain an unrealistic tableau of labor and services. And I can tell you that the state has strongly advised against this, and instead has said to state agencies, including the governor, that budget needs to curb spending. Number two, we could restructure government now, not wait for the unknown date by which the state will have better intelligence on its top line budget numbers, but to align services to population and need now. And then if we are so smart as to have overshot the goal in terms of how we do that, we can identify the means of rebounding. And another option may be simply to say to every department, and this has begun in kind of baby steps, I would say, is to impose a strict across the board percentage cut using a target percentage number and not be short. None of these are enviable. None of these are going to be easy, but they are going to require us to move forward and to do so as one town of Millis. and not in bifurcated departments and bifurcated business units. I have pledged, and I'm going to uphold this pledge, that this meeting will end promptly at noon, if not before, and we'll pick up the conversation on Monday night, the 11th, and going forward. And the public is invited to all of these. So in the interest of time, I think I would like to invite my colleagues from the board to answer or to amplify anything they feel should be done before turning the presentation of information over to the town administrator and the director of finance to go from here. Thank you. Anyone? Mr. McCaffrey? There you go.
All right, let's just get to work.
Sounds good. All right, town administrator, and is Carol on? Yes, she is. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you and the board know, at your last meeting, you had a discussion in which the board wanted me to put together, with the assistance of the finance director and the department heads, several sets of budget recommendations based on different revenue scenarios. I have done that. In the packet you received yesterday afternoon, you have a memo as well as information related to the different budget scenarios. So let me just walk through those a little bit and talk about that. And the finance director can certainly chime in where she feels is appropriate. The first document is the budget chart. It's about an 8-page chart showing, and it has columns of 3 different proposals based on certain assumptions of state aid and local receipts. The first column, moving across, you'll see is the FY21 budget proposal based upon the governor's original state aid numbers that were issued in January. The second column is a budget proposal based upon a scenario of a 5% reduction in state aid and local receipts. And the next column is a budget proposal based upon a 10% reduction in state aid and local receipts. Also, as part of this process with the department heads, and I'd like to thank all the department heads for their quick turnaround of this information and following up and getting information back to me in regards to not only where they would recommend those cuts be made if they were forced to do so, but also outlining some of the service implications of those adjustments. So there is information in your packet from them. Also in your packet is a list of FY21 budget ideas and comments that have been received by this office. So again, just to clarify, the original budget that the board received, proposed budget, was based on the governor's numbers back in January. And as of today, we have not received any updated state aid numbers, and we have no idea at this time as to when state aid numbers will be finalized. So we don't know if that's going to be in July, August, September. We don't know at this point. Do you have anything to add at this point, Carol, or on the overview?
No. No, the only thing that I would add is that this morning, the Mass Society of CPA are meeting with the DOR, and we should have information later on today or Monday as to whether or not we can accrue real estate taxes that come in July that are really FY 2020 real estate taxes. So you'll just have to stay tuned for that. The suggestion is that at most that the state has a $5 billion deficit right now on a $45 billion budget, which is about 10%. They have $4 billion in reserve, so obviously they won't use all of their reserve to balance their budget, but the cuts at this point are not expected to be greater than 10%.
And if I could add to that also, there's certainly a lot of uncertainty at the federal level as far as what aid may be available for states, cities, and towns to address lost revenue, but I know there are a number of bills, one critical one, as Congress has approved several trillion in assistance to small businesses to help keep employees on the payroll. They are also currently considering up to a $2 trillion bill that would help a number of organizations, including states and municipalities. If that were to pass, I saw a recent report that approximately $2.7 billion in federal aid would come to Massachusetts for that purpose. So again, these are items just to be aware of that are being discussed at the federal level. So again, based on the lack of revenue information at this time, as of today, my recommendation is still with the original budget. However, in light of the fact that we don't know what those revenue numbers are going to be, we have put together two sets of proposals based on a 5% and 10% reduction in state aid and local receipts. And just to give you a breakdown of kind of how, at least on a first pass for the board's discussion, those reductions would come down. On a 5% reduction, I'd be recommending a 10% reduction in the salary and wages of all employees that work in the Veterans Memorial Building, with the exception of the DPW and the Board of Health. And this would necessitate the closing of this building on Fridays to account for the loss of those 4 hours of staff time. And if the board were to go along with that, in that scenario, I would say that we would need to look at how we structure our work with the public as far as being able to manage staff time to be able to complete our tasks, which will still be at the same need and the same level with 4 less hours per week. It would also recommend as part of that a 10% reduction in the library budget. The library director has put together a narrative. You can look at that. It's my indication that would result in a reduction in the operating hours of the library, and then also place the library certification in jeopardy. So that is something to be aware of. So that's the overview of the 5% reduction, and that would be a reduction of about $160,000 on the municipal side. And a 5% reduction would also mean a reduction of the school budget of $296,798.
Mike, on the library side for the 5%, it's only a 5% reduction in the library on the 5%.
Oh, sorry, I take that back. 5%. Any questions on the 5%? I know the board has received, you have received a packet last night that outlines, you know, what those numbers would come out to in each department. Any questions on that, or should I move on to the 10% scenario? And again, in the first scenario, I tried to look at it, tried to spare public safety and public works from those cuts, but I'm unable to totally spare them in the second round of cuts of the 10% reduction. So in the 10% reduction of estimated revenues from state aid and local receipts, the following cuts or reductions would be made. It would be the elimination of the position of the Economic Development Director and Planner that was just recently created, the elimination of the position of the Energy Manager, the closure and elimination of the Recreation Department, the elimination of summer help for the DPW, as well as a $5,000 reduction, a further reduction in DPW expenses, a 10% reduction in the salary and wages of the Board of Health, a $25,000 reduction in the Fire Department overtime wages, and a $20,000 reduction in the Police Department overtime wages, with another $5,000 reduction in police expenses. This would represent a total reduction of the budget on the municipal side of $319,629 for a 10% cut. and a corresponding reduction in the school budget of $593,597. Any questions on the proposed 10% cut?
I have a question, which is when you looked at identifying those specific positions, did you look at revenue in as a metric for whether it's grants or anything that is specific revenue through those positions that either self-fund them and or are beneficial to the general fund?
We did, and it is certainly a careful balance between that and certain absolute must-fund positions and operations. And certainly, I will point out that these proposals do not account for any use of stabilization. The town may decide that certain aspects of these cuts, or the board may decide that certain aspects of these cuts, should they come to pass, may have to be mitigated by some other funding source if they reach the level of need for the community that there's a feeling that those funds are needed. And what I said at the beginning in regards to my current recommendation is still based on the original state aid numbers, because we really have no idea on what level. There's too many questions out there. We have no idea on what the actual revenue numbers are going to be. So I certainly agree that the process of going through budget reduction and discussion is critical and needed for planning purposes. My recommendation at this time is still to move forward in a planning process and be prepared once we do receive the actual final numbers to go back to a town meeting and make those adjustments. Having said that, I believe that, again, the numbers are still an unknown, and that when you do make these types of cuts to an operation, they do have ripple effects for a long time. Even if we were able to bring budgets up to, FY20 levels and FY22, there would still be damage and ripple effects from that. So I think that's something to keep in mind for the board, that, we, as you know, Madam Chair, municipalities don't turn on a dime. And the issue here is that the way we're structured, when you do have certain changes, the damages and ripple effects can be much longer term in the municipal or government sector than they are in the private sector in many instances. So I would be cautious to make any sweeping changes without concrete information. Carol, do you have anything else on the budget that I may have overlooked?
No.
Are there any questions on the documents that were sent out to the board on the budget, the revenue numbers, or the departmental numbers based on these different levels of cuts?
I don't have any specific questions on them at this point. I don't know what more you were planning to go through on your budgets. I have lots of thoughts and comments that I'd like to make, but I'd like to make sure you have had the opportunity to make all the statements you were planning to make, you and Carol, before I chime in with my thoughts. And certainly I want to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Well, those are really my overview. It's just a matter of how detailed you want to get into the budget numbers or the approach on different budget adjustments. So I'm certainly ready at this point to answer any questions that the board has as far as methodology or specifics on those proposals.
Well, I guess my first thought is, before I offer my thoughts, since I am technically the junior member of this team, my colleagues, and particularly Mr. McCaffrey, if he has any comments. Otherwise, I have a number I'd like to make at this point.
I'll make a couple of thoughts. First is a question. You've outlined a number of scenario reductions for the municipal departments and then there's just a number for the school department. Has there been any conversation with them as to what the impact would be of these cuts? Or not cuts, these potential reductions?
They are fully aware of the process we're going through, and of the 5 and 10% scenarios. And I know they've been looking at those, but I don't have any concrete information back from them as to what specific adjustments they would make in those scenarios at this time.
Okay, I guess it's a technical question, and maybe it's because I didn't read it closely enough. In some major line items like benefits, the scenarios, I think it's saying here that the scenarios assume a constant level of expenditure.
Exactly. No, no positions are getting eliminated that currently have benefits, so there would be no impact to the benefits.
If the recommendations call potential elimination of positions.
Yeah, there are a couple positions. However, we feel that, you know, with that, at least on the municipal side, we can't gauge the school side as of yet. On the municipal side, and perhaps on the municipal and the school side, we would look at any reductions in health insurance costs would be, at least on the short term, largely offset by unemployment costs and on the short term. I mean, on the long term, there would be savings. On the short term, there really wouldn't be any savings because of the trade-off between the health insurance costs and the unemployment costs. So we haven't made any adjustments there. There could be some minor adjustments made to that, but we didn't get into that level of detail at this point.
Okay, so I guess that I just want to observe that all this, of course, is trying to make an attempt to anticipate what the revenue picture is going to look like. At this point, I would like to know, and I don't know, Carol, whether you have any indication or whether we get this at our next meeting. The lion's share of the money certainly comes from local taxes and local receipts. What's the run rate right now? How are we holding up? Because that's going to be real data. We deferred the real estate tax collection a month. What impact is that having, if any? I've seen some reports that frankly tell me that the cash position of the town is relatively in good shape, because it's not just how much we're going to get, but how much do we actually have to fund operations in the short term. So I guess I'd like to learn a little bit more about that before we make any decisions, because the guesses that we're making in terms of state aid are certainly guesses only. And I think for this board and for the whole community, you don't want to act too soon and you don't want to act too late. So, because acting too soon means you do things to yourself that you didn't have to do, which, as the town administrator indicated, may have long-term negative impacts across the community. And if you act too late, then it's going to be even more draconian because you have to make up for lost time. And one other comment I'd like to make about the stabilization fund, and maybe this is just rose-colored glasses, I don't know. I don't want to be proposing a budget for 21 which makes any significant expenditure of stabilization. We need to hold the stabilization for situations where the revenue picture becomes even more dire than we might have expected. But that's just my view. I think that sounds like the state is in much worse shape than perhaps we are. It may have to tag into the rainy day fund sooner than we do. But I'm very concerned about developing a budget recommendation that utilizes stabilization at this point.
Okay.
For the answer on the tax revenue piece right now, the treasurer, just about 10 o'clock, sent me an email that the tax revenue year-to-date collections is approximately 91%, but keeping in mind the due date for taxes has been extended until June 1st. If you look specifically at fourth quarter taxes, the good news is the escrow companies did make payments on May 1st, and that represents about 60% of the tax revenue collections for the town. Total fourth quarter collections are at approximately 72%. Again, knowing that the due date is not until June 1st, and the residents that do not escrow payments typically wait until the due date, regardless of the current situation. And again, there is a question going before DOR today, if we can accrue real estate taxes that we receive in the month of July that are 2020 taxes, if we can accrue for those in FY20.
Well, that's not borrowing from next year. That is just recognizing
No.
the temporary delay in this year's collections.
Exactly.
Okay. So I guess I just want us to make decisions not only about what we think might happen, but we need to understand what our current fiscal situation actually is, and what risks we run by, maybe being a little aggressive in, or not premature in making reductions.
Well, I've got a few thoughts. First of all, I absolutely concur with what my colleague has said in terms of things like use of stabilization. To me, at this stage, minimal to none. It's only if we absolutely have to. I think we have no understanding yet of what's coming in the future. I have talked with our representatives Dooley and Linsky, and I guess the best I can say is that they're somewhat pessimistic in terms of the level of cuts that we're likely to have. But as Mr. Gazinski said, nobody knows for certain yet. I'm not in the favor of looking at things like our budget is going to remain as the original budget. I think that's looking at things through rose-colored glasses, that it's not going to happen. We know there's going to be some kind of cut. The extent of it is what we don't understand at this point. And so what I'm thinking in terms of has to do with maybe we take as a starter the least painful scenario at 5% and work with that. But my concern is also that even if we accept that as a starting point, that we not utilize all the available funds for other projects in the town, because then we get into the situation that, again, my colleague pointed out, if the cuts turn out to be more severe than we anticipated, now we have to take retroactive action, which can turn out to be even more painful than taking a proactive response at this time. I'm also concerned in terms of how we approach our budget for the areas where we know we're going to need to have response in the future. Everything I'm hearing is that the COVID virus may begin to wane a bit over the summer, but then come back fairly strongly in the fall. That by that time there may in fact be some mitigating medications available. That's great. But any likelihood of a vaccine is unlikely to be much available before first quarter of next year. So we could be back in similar straits, and we have to plan on that, even if it doesn't come as a result. So what I'm leading up to is my concern that whatever cuts we make, my recommendation is that the last area to be cut would be public safety. cutting them, at least at this time, to my way of thinking, is like shooting yourself in the foot. And to that extent, we need to look at the implications if we don't cut them, what it does to the available budget as proposed, say, in the 5% reduction, which shows about $571,000 of available, or was it, excuse me, 553,000 available. I apologize, read the wrong line. And how we want to proceed looking at the budget, keeping at least the critical functions available. I realize that if we end up having to go to a further cut, which is something none of us want, but we also have to be realistic looking at it, that gets into areas that are much more severe for everyone. So I won't go into some other thoughts I have, but those are my overviews at this point of where I think we ought to be. And in summary, it's basically, I think we would be realistic starting with a 5% cut, deciding how much of the available revenue we want to use, recognizing that we may need a lot of that if things don't pan out as we anticipated, and trying to avoid utilizing any of our stabilization, or at least to the greatest degree possible at this time, again, recognizing that the situation may require its use in the future. Also, I seem to think we've lost our video, but I don't know what happened. I can't start mine. Karen seems to be in control of it.
I think Karen is having some trouble with the
Hi,
bandwidth.
sorry, Pete. Yes, I'm shutting the video off because, yeah, my Zoom keeps cutting in and out, and since it's recording from here, I don't know if it's going to affect the recording, but I'm missing most of the meeting.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, we do what we have to do. I'll turn it back to the chair.
I would just contribute that I think that I would be in favor of moving toward the 10%. And the reason is, I think that even with the unavailability of all the state data, I think we'd be in a much stronger position long-term to have taken a worse case scenario rather than a more hopeful one. And I also want to agree with everybody who has said to not borrow from stabilization. I think that right-sizing a budget means you don't borrow to do it. So those are my two contributions to the conversation. The other one, though, I would definitely say, as a budgeting tool, what I don't want to do is shut off any, I'll use the term spigot, it's probably not the right word, but those departments that are actually bringing in money ahead of their cost doesn't seem to make sense to me at first blush in terms of cutting them. And specifically, I would definitely cite the position of economic development, which is going to be critical going forward from everything I've read, and I think common sense would dictate that, as well as energy. I mean, I think if we tally up the amount of grants and things that have been acquired for cost savings measures, it's fairly considerable against the cost of the position. So I'm curious about what either other department heads would have to say, or what Carol and Mike would consider to be a next step in this discussion process.
I'd like to make one quick comment, if I may, Lori.
Please, of course.
Much as I'd like to go along with the 10%, and I fully understand where you're coming from, I fear that we're getting into a more draconian cut at that point. There may be other ways to cut some things. My position on the 5% is and I would say this even for the 10, although I don't think it's tenable, is that at 5%, I think we can keep the public safety operational funded at the level they need to be funded to maintain support. Keep in mind that these people are out there working for us. If they're exposed, they have to put people who have been exposed essentially out of service for a period of time until they can be absolutely certain that they will not infect others. And so in essence, they're working with diminished staff anyway. I am concerned further that we not allocate any of the available budget at the 5% beyond what is necessary to keep public safety essentially whole, recognizing if things go south, they too are probably going to have to bear part of the burden. But my inclination is that our need is to maintain the public safety given what we're in the middle of at this time. Anyway, that's my thought.
I don't disagree with you on public safety. I'm not really responding, Pete, to any of the proposals that have been kind of mapped out, either the 5% or the 10%, but more of the broad concept of going after the 10% as a target and then identifying those services of greatest need, you know, as the government defines itself, quote unquote, essential versus non-essential services. And so in that respect, I totally agree with you that I think public safety is really essential. And I think that if you were to ask the taxpayers for whom we are all working, I think that they would say that public works and roads are also essential. On the municipal side specifically. I also would say that pennies, when compiled, end up being dollars. And I also think that there are a lot of ideas of ways to change how we do business overall. Electronic billing being one, consolidating the enterprise and stormwater bills, which would bring relief to the community for that year-end hit on stormwater, but also would reduce both the cost of postage as well as the labor involved in 5 mailings and bring it down to 4. I think that initiatives like that, which really couldn't be captured in these top line 5 and 10% budget scenarios, are also the types of reinvention and ingenuity that we should be looking at implementing. Because then when you do those things on a cumulative basis, they add up favorably, both for savings on the labor side as well as savings on the expense side, and value to the taxpayer at a time when taxpayers are really hurting. So Mike and Carol, I don't hear any other conversation. I don't know. Obviously, there's a lot of department heads who have joined this call. They're here in part either to explain their ideas and or to advocate for their departments. Either one is, available to them. I don't think there's anybody on this call that wants to be in a position of saying, that's a great idea, but I'm sorry, we can't fund it. But we obviously have to move forward. So I guess I'm looking, Carol, for your conversation about what you see as a reasonable next step.
Well, it's up to the select board as to what you're going to approve based on what the town administrator and I put together for you. If the decision by the select board is to go with the 5% reduction of state aid and local receipts, that's the plan that we'll have to put in place. We will have to put together 1/12 budgets for the select board to review, so we can have you forward those to the director of accounts to get those approved. In case the June 29th town meeting, the budget's not voted on or something happens and we have to delay the town meeting again. That will allow us to continue operations in the town we're going to ask you to put forward three 1/12 budgets. Doesn't mean the budget is divided equally by 12, but it is, have all of the expenses that you need to be paid for the month of June, the month of July, August, and September, so that we can get those in and get those approved by the Director of Accounts to just have in hand, so we know, at least if the town meeting doesn't happen the way we expect it to, we'll have something to go forward with for July 1st.
From what I've read, that sounds like a fairly consistent approach across the state, correct?
That direction for the 1/12 budgets was given to us by DOR, yes. Mhm.
Like we said, consistent.
One
So are
of-
you, go ahead, Pete, sorry.
Sorry, one other quick comment. If we go, let's say we did the 5%, I'm not saying we're going to, but let's say we did. I'm not suggesting that the available funds go through any split. Those funds remain with the town in anticipation of allocation based on need and as we see things progressing. So please understand, even in these scenarios, I know in the past, we typically took available funds and did a split. That's not what I'm suggesting. These funds have to remain available. Prudence dictates that we don't know what's going to happen. And to prematurely even spend those funds could be detrimental to how we proceed in the future. Anyway, my thought.
Madam Chair, I guess what I'd like to suggest here is that I'm not in favor of kicking the can down the road. This board has to come up with a guideline. If it's not today, it has to be Monday. It should be pursuant to some active dialogue with the school department, which is impacted significantly by these proposals. Not just let's guess what they think, let's at least engage in the conversation with them. And, I think that this is a tough decision to make, but, to keep going around and around and around is not the way to go. I mean, if we believe as a board that we should plan for a 5% reduction in state aid to create the budget, then let's get on with it. Let's not say, what do you want to, and then we get into the details. We know what our goal is. And I'm not saying I support that, by the way, because I think some of this is premature, but if the board wants to, shoot for 10, let's shoot for it. Let's not just keep developing multiple scenarios here. This is painful. No position is left unscathed. Frankly, if you cut in the treasurer's office, that slows receipts. I mean, it just does. There's just no two ways about it. If you reduce the hours in the Council on Aging, then our seniors are disadvantaged when they may be willing and able to get out from their homes and go to the senior center, which we'd have to reduce in terms of hours. Or once the library reopens, then we're going to have to tell people who are, desperate to go to the library that they can only go Tuesdays and Thursdays because we have to close it. And I'm not arguing that, that police and fire aren't critical, because they are. I don't see a lot of things we're doing that are fluff, but I'm sure there are better ways to do business. And I know the pennies create dollars, but I need $500,000, and that only comes through people. That's where the costs are.
Well, given that, what you're saying makes some sense, and I understand Lauren.
It makes a lot of sense, but
Go ahead.
it doesn't mean it's right. You don't have to agree to it.
I understand. I just said it makes some sense. I don't say I'm agreeing. I'm just saying it makes some sense. But I know Loring had advocated, or at least proposed, potentially a 10%. I'm trying to look at it in the middle. My attitude is fine. If we're going to make a recommendation, then my recommendation is at the 5% level, but we do not allocate the available funds even at that level for any split between departments. Those funds remain available to the town based on circumstances, because we don't know what the circumstances are going to be, but we can pretty well guess that we're not going to get 100% of the budget that we expected.
I would actually make a motion that the select board direct the town administrator and the director of finance to work with departments to implement what would amount to a 10% cost savings to include new ways of doing business to mitigate the labor impacts by achieving more cost efficiencies that favorably impact and reduce expenses and redundancy across town departments. I feel like that's a compromise, and it's also where we need to head operationally anyhow, because we do have departments. We just had a report by a DPW consultant who said we should be consolidating facilities and fields management. It seems to me that the reason that we ask for these independent consultant reports is to either validate some initial thoughts and insights, or to provide the drive to go forward and implement those changes. So that's why I'm saying not just simply go across and do a unilateral 10% across the board, but to look at ways that we can achieve efficiencies that reduce costs and, mitigate, any sort of, layoff scenario. You may be looking at changing the contribution of employees to healthcare plans, maybe one scenario. I mean, there's all sorts of ways, I think, to achieve a 10% contraction. My own feeling from everything I've read and from people I've consulted with, to include legislators, I think the 10% is going to be short. So that's why I would advocate for 10%.
Well, as I said earlier, I respect that. I think it's too draconian. I think the 5%, with saying we need to have the 5% in place, we should be looking at additional potential cuts. I have no problem with. But we have to give a very specific direction that says, if we're going to recommend a cut 5, 10, or whatever %, that's what we're recommending, period. There can be other things. And so given that, I would say 5%, and then additional, look at what the implications are if, but at least get the 5% going. But I also am saying what I just said before. The available revenue for appropriation doesn't get touched at that point, because I happen to agree. I think it's unlikely that we're going to be that we're only going to see a 5% cut. So you've
So
made
Jim, you have two motions on the table and they are not the same.
Well, we have one motion on the
one
table.
motion.
Second, so either we second it, discuss it and vote on it, or it fails for want of a second, and then we move on to the next thing.
Yep.
So I'm willing to second it for purposes of a vote.
Okay. So moved and seconded. I will do a roll call vote. The proposal being to target 10% overall budget cuts, as described, a combination of economizing and as well as ways to reorient the government so that we can reduce redundancy and achieve efficiency.
Can I just clarify, for discussion purposes?
Please.
The proposal, just to be clear, that we have in front of us is a 10% reduction in state aid and local receipts. It is not a 10% reduction in expenditure.
Correct.
Carol?
Yes, that's correct. You're correct,
So
sir.
it's going to be precise. It's precise to plan for a reduction of, reduction in revenue, which then leads to not 10% budget cuts, but a budget cutting process which goes through the budget to save that money. That's really what was proposed. Now,
Okay.
if we propose a 10% budget cut, that's a much bigger item. So which are we considering?
I assumed it was what Mike had put in his 10% state aid.
Yeah, but the
but
motion is
I
for
don't know.
budget cut. I just want to make sure I know what I'm voting on.
Yep, yep. Lauren?
I guess I'm looking for whichever one is going to have the greatest impact. What is going to be the one that's going to be the tool to really achieve reorganization and consolidation, as opposed to just looking at revenue in?
I'm going to comment, Lauren. If we deal with a 10% state aid cut, that's one thing. It's tough. I would almost say draconian. If you deal with a 10% budget cut, that's catastrophic. I mean, to deal with that, in my estimation, and this is my view, at this time would be a calamity. It's not something you can do overnight. It would mean massive changes. I don't believe we can deal with that at this time. If we had to, it would change us so dramatically, I don't even want to think about it. So I'm hopeful that you'll accept that a 10% cut in state aid is what you're after, and maybe what combined with total with that revenue. But that's where I'm at.
I don't disagree with you in principle, Pete. I just want to acknowledge that I think every single person on this call is probably in a position to look within their immediate life orbit of family and friends and neighbors. And for those people, a 10% reduction in costs right now would have very little impact overall, because they are plunged into complete free fall financially because they've lost their jobs and don't know how to pay their bills. So I just want to acknowledge that. I'm prepared to go forward with a motion of a 10% cut. But I would want to nuance the actual elements of what the proposal is before us, because I think we can achieve cost savings in other ways.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Please.
before the board votes, I would just reiterate my thoughts at this time, that I personally think it's premature to set cut, or even the 10% cut in state aid and local receipts at this time. So I appreciate the concerns. I appreciate, the desire to find savings where it may not have a direct impact on services. I can assure you that this office has been working on that as part of this process. If we thought we had low-hanging fruit to save funds, other than making these pretty harmful cuts, we would have, certainly presented those at this time. There's always ways to find certain savings here and there, but to find hundreds of thousands of dollars in operational adjustments that don't impact operations in the course of the next month is just, in my view, unrealistic. So that's all I have, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Kaczynski, I do have a question for you. I know what you're saying, if I'm interpreting it, is you want to go with the original budget with no cuts. And I have a hard time with that, because we know the state's already had major shortfalls. I can't believe, from what I'm hearing from our representatives, that we're going to get the budget funding. What did you have here?
The budget numbers we were given are level funding.
Right, level
Same as
funding.
last year.
And I can't believe we're going to be level funded based on anything I'm hearing. So given that.
My comment was the 10%. Certainly, if the board wants to consider a 5% and thinks that that's the best path for the town moving forward, and understands the operational impacts associated with that, then I'm not saying that's unreasonable. It's certainly, it certainly has to be a policy decision on the board as to how to move forward with this, in light of really a great deal of unknown factors moving forward. I agree that I think the chances of state aid dropping are high it's the scope of which that I think is up for debate. And I think there's very differing views on the amount of that adjustment moving forward.
Well, again, Chairman, all I'm asking is that the board give the administration here a direction. I think that's what we're trying to come up with. Now, what is that direction? If the direction is to create a 10% cut in the budget expenditure, then, and then with reinvention and et cetera, then we ought to vote on it. And if we're in favor of it, then they got to go do it. If we're not, then we move on to the next thing.
So the motion is on the table,
Yeah,
as indicated, and it's been second. And I will, and so what we're voting on is the target and with the assumption of the reduction of state aid at 10%, and we are not specifically approving a specific proposal that's been put before us. Is that, I just want to clarify that, correct, Mr. Town Administrator?
Okay, this is not what you just said before. You said you were in favor of a 10% budget reduction.
Yep.
So what is the motion?
The motion is to assume a 10% reduction in state aid and revenues. We've already lost revenues we're never going to reclaim.
Madam Chair, just to clarify, so if I, just for clarification for myself and the board, so what you're looking to do is vote to proceed with an expected 10% cut in state aid and local receipts, but not adopt the proposal of how that's done at this time.
Correct.
Okay, I just want clarification. All right, thank you.
Because I think there's a lot of stakeholders on this call that probably would bring things to light that, you know, we haven't had an opportunity, and probably you haven't had a full opportunity to hear from them in terms of impacts and their ideas to do things differently within government that could achieve economy of scale.
That's correct. I mean, because of the quick turnaround of these,
Right.
I have not had time to meet with all the department heads that may have had some adjustments to what these recommendations are. So, so I do understand that. Thanks.
So the motion stands as the original for the, with the assumption of a 10% reduction in receipts and state aid, and to pursue budget reformation on the basis of those assumptions at this point. I don't think that motion is largely unchanged, but I'm sure one of my colleagues will tell me if it is.
That's the motion.
Yeah. So I'll poll the board. Mr. McCaffrey?
No,
I'm sorry?
no, vote no.
No. Okay. Mr. Jermaine?
No.
Ms. Barnes, yes. Okay, so we've struck out at the 10%. So I guess I would go to the floor and,
Madam Chair, I object to you referring to it as strikeout. This
Okay.
board is trying to determine what is the best way to go forward.
yep,
The proposal, which was not adopted, to
Yeah.
characterize it as a strikeout, I think
okay,
completely off base.
okay. Sorry, it was a colloquial expression. I apologize, and no insult intended. So I would open the floor for alternative proposals.
Well, then I'm going to make a proposal that we go with a 5% local aid and state aid reduction as put forward in the memo that Mr. Kaczynski sent to us, with the understanding that we are not going to, I think that's just, I'll leave it at that. That's what I move, that we at least implement for a 5% cut of the state and local aid.
Second?
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
discussion, Mr. Germain, I guess again, the importance here is the precision of the proposal.
Yep.
If we are adopting a guideline and directing our administrator to come back to us with a 5% state aid reduction, which he's already done, by the way, then we can move forward on that basis. Now, this, of course, includes a reduction in the budget from the school department, which they haven't agreed to. But if that's the road we're going to go down, then we better move quickly to the details here. And I think we have many of those details. And I would hope that if we're going to have this direction, that we can have some resolution of this, in terms of the proposals by Monday. And as I've indicated, I'm very concerned that we're ready, shoot, aim here, but I'm certainly willing to have further discussion on this proposal.
As you understand, I am very concerned myself. And I agree, we need to hopefully have coordination with the schools. Not even hopefully, we have to have coordination with the schools. But I am of the opinion that we have to begin the process with the understanding that we are not going to be receiving the level funded amounts from the state or even locally that we've had in the past. It would be possible that we'll be close to level funded locally, which would be wonderful. But the state is very unlikely from everything I'm hearing and the conversations I've had. And so we ought to be planning accordingly. I don't know what that level would be, but I think as a first cut, recognizing I've talked with Mr. Kaczynski that these could be implemented without absolute total disruption to the operations of the town. It's not painless, but it's a process that has to be gone through. And it's in that respect that I feel we've got to start the process and not hope that things get better or wait until things deteriorate and then it becomes a fait accompli.
I would like to ask the town administrator what happens when the state aid numbers come in, and granted it's looking like we won't even hear from them until the end of the summer. So now this is going to be retroactive, and they come back and they say, we're reducing state support by 15%. If we only have planned for a 5% reduction, what is it that you would be implementing with the town leadership in response to that?
Well, first of all, I don't believe, I agree, there'll probably people here that think it will be 15% or even more. I don't believe it will be that high. But if it does come up at 15%, we would have to make mid-year adjustments to the budget. Worst case scenario, if we had to right size the government based on some unanticipated items that come up as far as major adjustments to our revenue, we would make adjustments at a fall town meeting, and that may mean solidifying further cuts. But again, I look at it from the perspective of if you make unnecessary cuts, it can do long-term damage to the organization, especially cuts on this level. I don't feel that we have the information at this point to make that level of cuts. That's simply my opinion.
Madam Chair.
Yes,
This is
sir.
Pete Berube. Forgive me if this discussion is not open to the virtual floor. Is it?
It is.
Okay. Well, I intended just to listen in and keep my discussion for Finance Committee meeting, but it seems appropriate to make a couple of comments now. And I would urge you all to consider not voting on cuts at all for the first quarter. And if the mechanics allow for adoption of the FY20 budget for the first quarter, don't bring it to town meeting, spring town meeting as the first quarter budget level, 0 increases. I know that several of the departments, including school board, have planned on a 4% increase, but leave it level funded for the first quarter, and then adopt or provide direction to the town departments to plan for specific reductions at either 10% or a minimum of 5%, and see what departments and services it makes sense to accept risk, and then via a special town meeting sometime during the first quarter of 21, adopt as you see fit and as you learn more information of what's coming from the state. Just as a note, I don't think you can have any of these discussions without knowing what the school board is able to do in their implementation of revenue cuts. I heard the number of 500,000 for a 10% associated with a 10% revenue cut. I assume it's half of that for a 5% revenue cut. I don't know how you vote that in without having them included in the discussion right now. And so that's why I would urge you to consider, again, adopting a budget for the first quarter equivalent to the FY20 first quarter budget, and then plan on having another dress at this sometime during the first quarter. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any thoughts or response to Peter's proposal?
I respect what Peter has to say. My concern is we know some level of cuts are coming. That's a given. I don't know the level. I'll be absolutely honest on that. None of us do. The reps don't know. The only thing they do know is that there are going to be cuts. And I think it prudent that if we don't fund at a level funded budget, it provides us the wherewithal to meet conditions that may yet be more difficult in the latter quarters of next year. I am very concerned that if we do level funding, that by the time we have to make changes, if we do, by the second quarter, if we wait until, say, November town meeting, then half of that year has gone, which is potentially a very large chunk of revenue spent that we should not have necessarily spent at that time. And so my point in going to a 5% cut is I think it will spare us first having any major cuts here. I do not know where the schools stand. I wish I understood better, but I don't. But I do know that Mr. Gazinski has looked at this with the town. It's difficult, but it's not, as he has used the words, draconian at 5%. It's something at least the town can live with. I don't know if he's had enough conversation with the schools to understand what would happen at a 5% cut to them, but I think it's something we have to look at, which is why I'm proposing it. That's my view.
So do we have a motion on the floor at this point?
Yeah, I thought I moved that we
5%, but can you just,
5%.
and 5% is specific to
The
budget
state-
assumptions on the basis of reduction of state aid by 5%.
State aid, local revenues, yes.
And the specific, just to clarify, Mr. Gazinski, in doing this, the select board is giving the direction of a budgeting target and not specifically adopting the proposals as have been set forth at this point as a preliminary discussion starter.
That is the clarification I wanted to get. So just deciding whether the board is adopting my recommendation on the adjustments or merely the baseline of a 5% cut in anticipated local aid and local receipts. So again, I just wanted that clarification.
For me, singularly, I would not want to simply be adopting the recommendations as they are, because I think that there's probably some more and maybe perhaps different approaches that will emerge from a little bit more time than you and all the department directors have had at this moment coming before this meeting today, even though we had a week of time from our last select board meeting. But that's just my one opinion.
Yeah, I'll go along with what the town administrator has suggested as part of the motion.
I will second that, and I will pull the board.
Can we have discussion first, please?
Sure, sure.
I think it is somewhat unrealistic for us to assume under this vote that the proposal coming back to us, and it's not months from now, it's a week or two, is going to be substantially different from what we already have in front of us. Now, that's directionally what will happen to the town administration on the municipal side is laid out here. Now, it may be tweaks here and there, but to me, it's unrealistic to assume that it'll be dramatically different from what we see in front of us. So I don't want anybody to suggest that we're going to go along with this, get something that is much different from what we've already seen. And in terms of Mr. Berube comment, which is a little off topic, but nevertheless, it's a thoughtful proposal, which is allowable, I guess, under the. It's not clear to me that the board couldn't do that unilaterally, by the way. By failing to adopt a budget, we could, in fact, operate at 1/12 of this current fiscal year's for the first month or so. You could buy some time doing that if you wanted to. And maybe Carol or Mike, you could clarify that. But the implications of doing 1/12 of this year means that none of the pay increases that were negotiated either with the union or with individuals would be able to be paid. Because we just, we wouldn't be paying the increases.
That's correct.
So decisions, votes taken have implications. I'm really, what I don't want to do, of course, and I don't think anybody wants to do, is kick this can down the road. I think it's important for us to realize today that I believe a large majority of what we're going to find as a budget recommendation is already in front of us. I certainly wanted to give ourselves some more time, but I think it's important to realize that it's not going to be that different from what we see. Now, if we tell the budget administrators that what we want to do is leave public safety whole, well, then it will be different.
Madam Chair, this is Pete again.
Please.
If I can just kind of respond to what Mr. McCaffrey just said. I think my intent of my proposal was to do exactly that, allow the time to put more thoughtful consideration into where it would make cuts. And I would urge everybody to not necessarily look at this as an axe versus maybe rather look at it as using a scalpel, and given the time to do that, where cuts could potentially be considered as reductions. I think if the town had the ability to make reductions like deferring raises or potentially contract renegotiating, deferring maintenance, canceling contracts or descoping those things, which haven't been done. To me, I think the proposal that's been put forth by Mr. Kaczynski, based on probably the time constraints, is that it's very cursory. And a deeper dive needs to be done, and it needs to be done quick, but you're not going to do it in the next week or two. And in my, limited opinion, that reductions would be preferred to cuts. And this would give you the time at least to prepare for a worser case scenario than a 5% reduction in revenue or expenses.
I respect what you're saying. My concern is we have to be prepared to have a budget in place, good, bad, indifferent, and we have to make the recommendation, to the town. And that's what we have to deal with. It's a reality. Wishing it weren't so, or making changes can be made subsequent even to the adoption, even if we had to have a special town meeting. But we have limited time at this stage to make a proposal of how we want to see our budget, at least through the beginning of next year, fiscal year, I should say. And that's my concern, is that I am loath to see the budget move forward for the beginning of the next fiscal year as a level funded budget from this year, regardless of the fact that we don't know the amount that's less necessarily going to come in terms of cuts to state aid. And yeah, I don't like the ambiguity, but I think it's prudent that we start at some level. If we ended up by second quarter finding out that state aid came in essentially level funded, I believe from what I've talked with Mr. Kaczynski about is that a 5% cut would not have been so draconian that we can't recover from it during the next few quarters. I would love to see that happen. I'm not certain I believe that, but at least I would love to see it happen. The reverse could also be true, and that's the part that bothers me the most. At any rate, that's where I am. My concern is.
Madam Chair,
Please.
I think that I would support Mr. Germain's view that we ought to go in with a budget. It actually, of course, does not preclude Mr. Berube notion, because if in fact, which may well happen, some additional developments occur, we're not without the ability to make adjustments. And that would be, as indicated, either we would have a special town meeting, or if we were able to, look at the situation and decide we could go through to the fall, that would be something that we could take a look at. We haven't even talked about warrant articles and whatnot, some of which require expenditure. And those issues, if we're going to try to save cash so that we can support our operation, we need to look at not just that, not just the people, as I've been indicating, but also any projects that we may need to put on hold. I think that, as Mr. Berube indicated, maybe there are some things that are discretionary, if you will, that could be delayed a year to help us preserve the situation. And I'm thinking about capital projects. Because the Capital Planning Committee, of course, went through the projects last night, and there are a number, and it pared down most of the requests to a very few, but they still amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think we need to, think through that as well. On the other hand, I think if we don't give our team some firm direction in terms of the number, then we're not going to get some of the hard thinking that we think we need. I'm very reluctant to adopt a budget with a 5% state aid assumption, but I'm willing to support that at this point in time because I think the hard work needs to occur. I'm just observing that I'm not sure that it's going to be much different than what we've already been presented, but maybe it will be. Maybe there's some breakthrough idea here. I don't know.
Does it make sense in anybody's mind to split the uprights here and target a 7.5%? I'm really concerned that we're going to hear devastating news at the state level, and then that the need to react to that is going to be much more severe and abrupt. And that's why I was kind of hoping to achieve a target that would be probably a little bit, would mitigate that event. Whether or not you have to have a separate town meeting or not, I'm just really concerned that we're going to find a significant gap between where we start to include suspending of outbound spending right now, as can best be done, and when we hear from the state. That's my concern. I feel like 5% is not anywhere close to anything I've read and anything I've researched. I just think it's too gentle.
Well, it's a start, and we certainly have to continue to look at the implications if we see a deterioration in potential state aid as the year progresses. But my feeling is we give it a start. We give it a start at a value that isn't absolutely a killer for the town. As my colleagues so nicely pointed out, it gives the town a chance to revise what they've already given us, maybe in terms of how we approach public safety and so forth, but at least to start on the process. I'm loath to consider much more. I've looked at it. I've talked with people. I'm just concerned that that's as far as I'm prepared to go at this time, knowing as little as I know about what's likely to happen in the future.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly, looking for at this point in time, this 5% guideline. As I said, like the devil's in the details. It always is. And so I think it applies, you know, a 5% reduction in state aid is a significant reduction. And if it's not enough, then, you know, we have more things that we have to do. I do want to have the finance department keep this board informed on a regular, not that you're not doing it now, but on a regular basis. I want to understand what the collections are, where it's running versus prior year, because we're talking about the state aid number, which with all, you know, it's a critically important number, but it's not the only number. In fact, where the bigger risk, or at least as big a risk, is that the other revenue sources start to slow down. And that makes the problem that much more significant. So again, I've taken a look, you know, at the cash situation. It seems to be reasonably robust. That tells me that collections are holding up, but I don't want to guess. I would like to, and I'm talking about those collections that we make locally, real estate taxes, fees, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to understand both how they're holding up, because it's also going to be a reflection of how our citizens are being challenged, because if they can't pay their taxes, you know, then we really need to understand that we just don't have the bandwidth any longer to support the service level. So I'm willing to support the 5% because it's a guideline. I do want to outreach to the school department to see how they take a look at this. But I really think this board needs to look at the full financial picture, not just the revenue projections.
Yeah, I think that that's the bigger concern, because we're never going to reclaim, for example, the HCA cannabis revenue that has been lost with the cessation of the adult use dispensary as an income source that was targeted to fund a police officer. And we're never going to recoup the lion's share of the meals taxes. We don't know what's going to end up happening with respect to businesses going forward, those that we may in fact lose. So I think there's a much bigger economic scenario that has yet to be played out. So I feel that the 5% is going to end up being not enough. That's my own opinion. But there is a motion on the table, and I believe it was seconded. Is that accurate?
I believe so. I think you seconded it.
Okay. Okay. So I will poll the board. Mr. McCaffrey,
Yes.
Mr. Germain,
Yes.
Ms. Barnes, no. The motion passes 2-1. And so that will be the starting discussion point and budget tool for the town going forward. I think there's still things that we need to be doing. To Mr. Germain's separate point, there are cost containment steps that need to be taken immediately. And those, I assume, are going forward. Maybe the town administrator has some comment about that.
Well, certainly, I will be meeting with the finance director as well as department heads to review the budget again, and look at ways we can save revenue without these other types of cuts. But I'm afraid to say most of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. And we will continue to work on that. And we'll have some updated information to hand out to the board on Monday, based on some discussions we can have during the day on Monday. But we will move forward with the budget as the board has just voted. Madam Chair, did you want to take up any of the feedback on the budget or at this time, or do you want to delay that till later?
It's really the, we did invite public input and questions for budget related planning. And so it's really up to the group if you want to hear this now, or if you want, I don't know how much time Mr. Gazinski really had to work with any questions within Town Hall. You may want to, in fact, look at that as something that maybe creates some ideas for the future.
I would agree. I would agree
Okay.
with that.
Madam Chair,
Sure.
just to be sure, and I want to make sure that folks who may be listening understand this. There was written material circulated prior to the meeting from department heads and others. And I want to make sure that that information is posted and easily accessible to folks if they want to take a look at it. I'm not sure of the mechanics here, but sometimes when I go on the website and I look up the board meetings, it's easy to find the meetings, the agendas, the minutes, a little harder to find the support material. These are all public documents with, as you indicate, a lot of thinking going on. I just want to make sure not only does the board see it, but certainly everybody, all the public sees it, and it's also shared with interested department heads and whatnot. And I think that's really important.
I totally agree. Mr. Gazinski and Carol, what do you recommend, or what are your plans in terms of anchoring all the FY20 budget documents? Are they going to be on the finance webpage?
We can either, yeah, we can put that on the finance page, and we can put a link to it on the homepage of the website.
Mm-hmm.
All of the information given to the Finance Committee is on the Finance Committee website, and it has all the budget information there with all the meeting materials.
Okay. Yeah, I saw a pretty long list, Jim.
But we can, if the board would like, we can add this particular packet, which I'm sure the public would have an interest in. We can put a link to that on the homepage if people want to take a look at that.
Well, my feeling is the source of this information is the administration, the select board, and the departments. I'm happy that the finance committee is putting it on their webpage, but the source of this information is here. So we should be publishing it.
Right.
And I think that's easy enough achieved.
And I have another matter that's related, which was referred to a few minutes ago, which is the the short-term issue of preserving cash, from May 1st to June 30th. If we are looking to do that, we better be clear as to what it is we're looking to do. And if we want a specific proposal from the administration as to how we will do that, I think we need to understand that. It's not just a general, let's not spend the money if we don't have to. What are we deferring? What are the implications of that? Keeping in mind that it's important to understand that if we preserve cash in the short term, what happens with it, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it then ends up as free cash, meaning the free cash amount might be bigger next year. And of course, free cash is not something we know of going into town meeting or budget season. If we're looking to save some money and we have some things that we could defer, it will help us, in the short run. It won't help us with this exercise, but it could help us in the fall.
I not only support what you're saying, I think it gets back to understanding the implications of what we do versus what we don't do.
Right.
That's part of what,
I was just, yeah, Peter, I was just
I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
comment, and I wanted to make sure that we get through. I want to reemphasize the importance of that to the administration. And if, not only do I want to understand what we're doing vis-a-vis income, but what's happening with respect to the budget items that we already have funded, but perhaps we could defer. And I think it's important because, and frankly, I would like that to be something that we get recurring reports on for probably a year or more, because we got to keep our fingers on the pulse here.
I think your point is well taken, Jim. I just want to point out for those people who don't monitor their chat, I just circulated a link that I believe, to Carol's point, is a compendium of a variety of budget-related documents up to the present. The Finance Committee meeting agenda is there. This particular operating FY21 operating budget, things like that. So there are a lot of tools that are in this one place. And I think Carol and Mike, if you guys could look at what's here and then determine what needs to be added and whether or not specific documents or even just this link needs to be added to other web pages, I think that would be helpful. Did everybody, I guess I just don't know the answer to this, Mike, did all the department heads actually receive the various budget proposals that were provided to the select board and presumably to which they contributed in advance? I have no idea.
We did reach out to all the department heads. All the department heads did submit based on a 5 and 10%, or most of the department heads submitted based on a 5 or 10% cut. But the last draft of because again of the timing, the last draft of this was submitted to the selectmen late yesterday and the full draft didn't get out to all the department heads because of a time issue. But I will be meeting with all department heads next week to discuss the current budget scenarios and discuss possible impacts of that moving forward.
And Karen just shared a chat, again, if people aren't looking at it, that she just posted all these meeting materials on the select board website page. So they can be found there.
Yes, Loring, I was gonna add that. So if you go to the select board page under agendas, and I just simply uploaded the PDF, which is what everybody got for the meeting in advance that I was told to send it to.
Excellent. So the next steps on this are to continue the conversation on Monday night with everybody having an opportunity to kind of sift through the specific proposals that were given to us as a version 1.0. Does that sound like a fair next step?
Yep. Agreed.
I think you cut out. Oh, agreed. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear it. So, and with that, all the elements of the warrant are in the process of being formulated. The pushing back on the town meeting date gives us the opportunity to work with the school committee, finance committee, all the departments to bring completion to some of the bylaw amendments that the select board has inquired about. And so that document, that menu will be is in the process of being developed. And if there's no further questions, it would give me great pleasure to actually beat the noon deadline and to acknowledge and thank everybody who has participated on this call today. And I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
Second?
So moved and seconded. I will poll the board. Mr. Jermaine,
Yes.
Mr. McCaffrey,
Yes.
Ms. Barnes, yes. I wish everybody a safe weekend, a very happy Mother's Day. Don't forget to bring in your plants. We're supposed to get a blast of Arctic air. And we will reconvene as a select board on Monday late afternoon. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Karen and Mike and Carol inside of Town Hall for coordinating all of this.
All right, thank you.
All righty.
Thank you.